The cowboy thought the woman was just hungry for food, but her hunger was something else. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sky was losing its light when Caleb Rourke left the general store and crossed the back end of the trail town. He had been in town only long enough to buy flour, salt, coffee, and a strip of cloth for mending. He didn't stay to talk. He didn't sit for whiskey. He avoided the saloon because he didn't want eyes on him. Since his wife and unborn child died 4 winters back, he kept to himself. He hunted, trapped, patched fences, and slept alone in a leaning cabin near the creek. He only came to town when the supplies in his pantry were nearly gone. Caleb was 36, strong from work, with shoulders hardened by years of carrying lumber and hauling carcasses. His jaw was rough with several days' growth, and a scar curved near his cheekbone from a ranch accident years ago. He'd once planned to build extra rooms on his land for a family. The framework of one half-built wall still sat behind his cabin, but he hadn't touched it in years. He didn't come to town searching for company, trouble, or conversation. As he walked past the livery, a movement behind the stacked barrels caught his eye. At first he assumed it was a drunk or a thief. He almost kept walking, but something in the stillness made him look a second time. A woman sat with her back against a barrel, knees drawn in, arms around her legs. Dirt streaked across her face and collarbones. Her dress had been ripped at the neckline, so wide that half her chest was exposed. The bodice hung loose over one breast. The side seams had split, and the skirt was torn up one thigh, showing bruised skin. She was young, mid-20s at most. Her hair was long, tangled, and dark. She didn't speak or move. Her eyes followed only his hands, not his face. Caleb had seen women in worse shape, especially near mining camps and way stations where men paid for whatever they could take. He didn't want involvement, not with lawmen nearby or drunks roaming alleyways. But her shoulders were shaking slightly from cold or hunger, and he could see the bruising on her ribs through the torn fabric. He didn't feel heroic. Mostly he felt irritated that he noticed it all. Still, he reached into his saddlebag and took out jerky and hard bread. He crouched, set the food down near her boot, and stepped back. She didn't grab it immediately. Her eyes darted to his belt, then to the road behind him, then back to the food. When she reached, she did it fast, like someone might yank it away. She ate with short, defensive bites, watching him the whole time. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't want her thinking he expected anything. Her breathing was uneven. Every few seconds, she glanced down the alley as though expecting men to appear. The bruises at her shoulder and ribs weren't old. Likely days old, maybe less. Caleb could guess the kind of group she'd been with. Some outfits traveled with stolen women, trading them for supplies or favors. He'd heard stories, but never stepped in. Not his fight, not his burden. When she finished eating, he picked up his reins and turned toward the road out of town. His plan was the same as always: ride back to his cabin, stoke the fire, and sleep. But footsteps followed, soft at first, then close enough that he stopped and turned. She was on her feet, unsteady. Dirt caked her calves. The hem of her skirt was torn to shreds. She didn't ask anything. She just stood there breathing hard, her arms wrapped around herself. "You don't owe me nothing," he said, voice flat. "Food's done. That's it." She shook her head once. Not pleading, more like refusing the idea that he'd leave her behind. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. She laid a hand over her stomach, not because she was hungry, but because pain ran along her ribs when she moved. Caleb hesitated. He thought about riding off and letting her stay here, but he knew the kind of men who might pass through after dark. She wouldn't last the night without someone claiming her. That thought made him grit his teeth because he didn't want to be responsible. He didn't want any woman inside his space again. But walking away would mean she'd get dragged somewhere worse. "My place is far," he said. "I'm not carrying you." She didn't smile or beg. She only followed when he started walking the horse. He didn't slow his pace much, but he kept an ear open for her footsteps. Twice she stumbled, and he thought she might collapse, but she kept going. By the time they reached his land, the air had gone colder. The creek beside his cabin reflected nothing but darkness. The cabin itself looked worn, logs patched with mud, one shutter broken, smoke hole above the roof. He lit a stub of candle and opened the door. Inside was one table, two stools, a pile of wood, a stone hearth, and a cot near the wall. Nothing more. He didn't invite her in with words. He just left the door open and started placing kindling in the hearth. She stepped in slowly. Her eyes moved to the corners, the windows, the single door. She was checking for danger, not comfort. Caleb grabbed an old quilt from a crate and laid it in the corner away from his cot. He didn't offer explanations. She lowered herself onto it without speaking. When she shifted, the torn bodice slipped further. He looked away and kept his eyes on the fire. He spoke once more without softness. "You sleep there. I don't touch you. You don't touch me." She didn't answer. Her arms wrapped around her knees. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes stayed on the door, even after he sat by the fire with his back to the wall. He didn't feel relief or satisfaction, only a dull uncertainty, like he'd just invited trouble he couldn't measure yet. But he also knew he wouldn't have slept if he'd left her in that alley. That was reason enough, at least for tonight. Caleb didn't sleep right away. He sat with his back against the log wall near the fire, watching the flame catch along the kindling. The woman, she hadn't given her name yet, sat curled on the quilt in the corner. She didn't lie down. She kept her back against the wall and her eyes half closed, but her gaze flicked toward the door every time wind pushed against it. Caleb could tell she expected someone to come after her. He wondered how far behind those men might be, or if they had even noticed she'd slipped away. He took his coat off and hung it on the peg near the door. His revolver stayed within reach on the stool beside him. He wasn't worried about her attacking him, but he was thinking ahead, if someone came knocking, or if she bolted in the night and led trouble back. He looked at her again. Dirt streaked her neck and forearms. The exposed part of her breast from the torn bodice showed a dark bruise near the collarbone. Her legs were pulled close, so the ripped skirt still gaped across her thigh. She didn't try to cover herself. Maybe she didn't have the energy, or maybe modesty had stopped mattering a long time ago. He realized she was shivering. The cold from outside stayed in her bones. Caleb stood, pulled an old wool blanket from the shelf, and walked over. She tensed when he came near, her eyes snapping open with that wild flash people get when they're used to being grabbed. He knelt and placed the blanket in front of her, not touching her. She hesitated, then pulled it around herself without a word. He went back to the fire. She didn't sleep for a long time. Caleb closed his eyes but kept his ears tuned. When the fire dropped low, he added wood. Her breathing stayed light and alert. At some point, near dawn, she finally eased on her side and went still. Caleb got up quietly before the light came through the small window. He slipped on his coat and stepped outside to the lean-to where he kept chopped wood and tools. The cold slapped his face, but the silence felt better than four walls. He fed the horses, checked the coop for eggs, and hauled water from the creek. He wasn't trying to impress her. It was simply the work he did every morning. When he came back in, she was awake and sitting against the wall again. She hadn't run. Her eyes tracked him as he set the bucket down. He noticed then that she sat with one arm pressed against her ribs like the movement hurt. He knelt by the hearth, lit the fire again, and set a tin pot with water. He broke off a piece of dried venison to boil it soft. She finally spoke when he set a cup of warm water near her. "Nora," she said, voice rough. He didn't ask her name, but now he had it. He nodded once. "Caleb." She didn't ask where she was or why he brought her. She seemed to already know the only reason. He hadn't left her to the men who would have taken her again. Still, he asked the one question that mattered to his safety. "Anyone coming after you?" She stared at the steam rising from the cup. Her silence stretched long enough he thought she might ignore him. Then she shook her head slowly. "They were asleep when I ran. They won't track this far. They sold me off 2 times. I don't think they care if I'm dead now." Her voice had no tremble, just a flatness that came from being used past fear. Caleb didn't ask who they were yet. She looked exhausted and brittle. He figured answers would come on their own. He handed her a bowl when the meat softened. She ate slower this time, not like last night. Between bites, she asked, "Why out here alone?" He didn't like the question, but he answered because she'd given him hers. Wife died. Child with her. Been here since. She absorbed that without apology. Her eyes lowered once, then lifted again. I won't cause trouble, she said. Just don't send me out yet. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't plan to drag her anywhere. But he also didn't know if keeping her would blow a hole in the quiet he'd built. Still, she was sitting there in torn clothes, bruised, watching the door like an animal that had been kicked too many times. He could see she hadn't decided yet if he was safer than what she left behind. He finished his meal and stood to put on his coat. He needed to check traps in the gully and split more wood before dark came again. She watched him like she expected him to tell her to get out. He didn't. You stay here, he said. Firewood stacked by the door. There's water in the bucket. If someone rides up, you stay quiet. She nodded once. No argument. No plea to follow. Caleb stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him. He stood for a moment, listening for movement inside. Nothing. Just a fire crackling. As he walked toward the trees where his traps lay, his mind kept circling the same questions he hadn't asked her. How many men had held her? How far she'd come on foot? And whether she understood she could sleep here again tonight without paying for it. He didn't have answers yet, but he knew this. She was here now, and he'd made the choice to let her in. The rest would come whether he wanted it to or not. Caleb followed the creek bed out toward the line of pines where his traps were staked. The sun was only a thin strip over the hills, and frost clung to the brush. He moved with the same steady pace he always had, but his thoughts dragged back to the cabin. He'd expected to feel uneasy leaving a stranger there, especially a woman who'd clearly been through hell, but what unsettled him more was how natural it had felt to tell her to stay. He hadn't had another voice inside his home in 4 years. He didn't know what he'd do if she didn't stay past nightfall, and he didn't know what he'd do if she did. Along the stream, he found one rabbit caught clean and a second trap empty with the bait gone. He reset both, skinned the rabbit on the spot, and wrapped the meat in cloth he kept in his coat. It wasn't much, but it would stretch a day or two. On his way back, he cut through the aspen rise where he kept a hidden lean-to full of split logs under a tarp. He swung an armful over his shoulder and carried it to the cabin. When he reached the clearing, he paused beside a low stump and listened. No strange voices. No hoofbeats. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin but steady. That meant she kept the fire alive. Inside, Nora had moved from the corner. She sat near the hearth on the quilt, legs folded under her, blanket still around her shoulders. Her hair looked different. She'd pulled the worst of the tangles out with her fingers. The bruising on her collarbone and shoulder was clearer now in the light. Someone had grabbed her hard. She watched him come in, not startled but measuring. Her eyes dipped to the rabbit, then to the wood he set by the wall. He noticed something else. She cleaned the tin cups and bowls. His shirt, the one with the ripped elbow, lay rinsed and draped near the fire to dry. She found a wash tub by the door and used the leftover water. He didn't ask why. It was something to do, and doing something made people feel less like ghosts. He set the rabbit on the table and began cutting it into pieces for stew. She watched his hands but didn't move in closer. After a while, she shifted and pressed a palm to her ribs again. Her breathing tightened when she straightened her back. Caleb glanced at the bruise spreading under the torn strap of her dress. You break anything? He asked. She hesitated. No, just hurts to lie down flat. One of them kicked me when I got loose. He waited. She didn't add more, but he could see her weighing how much she should say. He spoke without turning. You got any people that might come looking? Family? Someone who knows your name besides me. Her answer came slow. No family left. I was with a wagon group for a time, but they traded me when they ran out of goods. The men after took turns passing me along. Last camp was south of here. I slipped out before they woke, but I don't know if they'll follow. Caleb's jaw worked. He didn't ask what they'd done. The condition of her clothes and skin made it obvious. He focused on the knife, cutting clean lines through the meat. She kept her arms tight around her stomach like she was waiting to be told to leave. He set the pot over the fire, added water and salt, then finally looked at her. No one rides out this way unless they're lost. If someone comes, I'll know before they hit the clearing. She didn't seem reassured, so much as surprised he'd bothered to say it out loud. He reached into a crate under the table and pulled out an old flannel shirt. It was too big for her, worn soft from years of use, sleeves patched at the elbows. He laid it on the table. When the stew's done, you can change. Your dress won't hold through the night. Her eyes landed on the shirt, then lifted back to him. She didn't thank him, but she nodded once. Gratitude didn't come easy to people who'd paid for every favor with their body. He understood that without her saying it. The rest of the afternoon passed in small movements. Caleb split firewood outside and brought in a stack. Nora cleaned the table with a cloth she found by the basin. When he stepped inside again, he saw her testing her steps across the floor, slow but not weak. The blanket still clung around her shoulders, but the torn bodice had slipped farther down one side. He forced himself not to stare. Not because her body didn't draw his eyes. Her curves were hard to ignore, the shape of her breast clear where the fabric had ripped, but because looking too long would put pressure on something neither of them was ready for. As dusk fell, the stew filled the cabin with the smell of meat and salt. The air warmed. Caleb set 2 bowls on the table and waited to see if she'd sit. She did, carefully lowering herself onto the stool and adjusting the blanket so it didn't slip. He noticed then that she glanced not at his bowl, but at his hands, checking his intent. They ate in silence. Halfway through, she spoke without looking up. "If I stay a few days, I can help with washing or mending. I'm not useless." Caleb didn't answer at first. He took another bite, then said, "I didn't bring you here to work." She held his gaze for the first time since entering the cabin. "Then why? Men don't take in women like me unless they want something." He met her stare. "You were starving behind a barrel, and no one else bothered. That's the only reason." She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't argue. Her breathing eased a little. She finished eating, wiped her fingers on the edge of the blanket, and stood to carry both bowls to the basin. Caleb watched her move with a careful gait, like her body still expected pain. He added one more log to the fire while she set the bowls down. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the shutters. He didn't say anything more, but a thought formed clear in his mind. Whatever had happened before, no one would touch her under his roof unless it was by her choosing. He didn't tell her that, but the decision was made the same way all his choices have been lately. Quiet, firm, without waiting for permission. Nights settled hard, and the wind coming off the ridge sounded like something dragging along the roof. Caleb checked the door latch once, then again. Habit. He wasn't used to another person sleeping under his roof anymore, and his thoughts moved slower than usual because he kept listening for sounds that didn't belong. Hooves, a voice, a knock. None came. Nora sat on the quilt in the corner where she'd slept the night before. She held the old flannel shirt he'd given her, turning it in her hands like she was waiting for him to change his mind. Her dress was still torn across the chest and thigh, and the bruises on her shoulder and ribs were darker in the lamplight. She'd washed her face and arms earlier, and though the dirt was gone, the weariness was sharp in her eyes. Caleb didn't push her to change. "There's water still warm in the basin," he said, nodding toward it. "Sure will fit better if you wash up first." She waited a moment, then stood carefully. Every movement showed where the pain sat in her side. She crossed to the basin, set the shirt on the stool, and unhooked what was left of the dress laces. Caleb turned away without her asking, busying himself with the fire even though the flames were steady. He didn't hear vanity in her silence, just the instinct to stay unseen when undressing near a man. When she finished washing, she slipped into the flannel shirt. It hung loose on her frame, coming down past mid-thigh, leaving her legs bare above the knee. The collar fell open at the top, showing the line of her collarbone and part of the bruise still fading across her chest. The sleeves were too long, covering her hands until she rolled them once. Caleb glanced at her only long enough to make sure she wasn't dizzy or bleeding. She folded the ruined dress and set it aside like it was something she might still need. He noticed the way she kept her back to the wall, never with her back exposed to open space. "You can take the cot tonight," he said. "Floor's colder now, the ground's freezing." She reacted like he'd spoken a threat. Her breath caught, and her shoulders went tight. "I'll stay on the floor," she said quickly. I don't sleep on beds with," she stopped, jaw locking. He kept his tone flat. "I'll sleep by the fire." The cot's yours until you're healed up or gone. Take it or not, but I won't drag you onto it. She watched him carefully, waiting for a trick hidden behind the offer. When she saw none, she moved to the cot slowly, like the boards might give way. She didn't lie down at first, just sat, feet on the floor, hands in her lap. Caleb turned down the lamp wick and lowered himself onto the blanket near the hearth. Window latch needs pushing in tight, he said. Wind'll rattle, it open otherwise. Doors barred. No one gets in quiet. Those details weren't just explanation. They were reassurance said in the only language he knew. She looked at the door, then the window, then at him. She nodded once and lay back on the cot, keeping the blanket over her even though she still wore the shirt. Minutes passed. Her breathing didn't settle right away. Caleb listened to the shift of the mattress as she adjusted each time pain or fear made her body tense. He stared at the fire, jaw tight. He didn't know why it bothered him to hear her brace herself for things that weren't coming, but it clawed at him all the same. When the fire dropped low, he pushed a new log onto the coals. Behind him, he heard her speak for the first time since lying down. You said you lost a wife. He didn't turn. 4 winters back. Fever took her and the child both. There was silence, then a quiet. Mine died. Not by sickness. Men took me after. No one came looking. She didn't say more, and he didn't ask. She wasn't telling it to get pity, just to state the fact that she had belonged somewhere once, and now she didn't. After a long pause, she added, If they come this way, I won't bring them to your door. I'll leave before that. You're here now, he said. If someone shows up, I'll deal with it. She didn't understand why he'd risk getting mixed into something that wasn't his. He could see it in her face when he glanced over his shoulder. She learned that most men only helped when they wanted something returned. He stretched out near the fire, kept his gun in reach, but his voice even. Sleep. I'm not moving from this spot. Her shoulders eased a little. The flannel shirt slipped off one shoulder when she turned to lie on her side. She pulled the blanket higher without knowing he'd seen. Her breathing slowed by degrees until the tension in the room loosened. Caleb didn't sleep for another hour, but when he finally let his eyes close, the quiet inside the cabin felt less like a burden and more like something holding shape around them both. The wind outside still scraped the shutters, but for the first time since he found her, she wasn't looking toward the door. Caleb woke before first light, same as every morning. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air inside the cabin held a cold bite that crept in through the floorboards. He pushed himself up slowly so the cot wouldn't creak and looked over. Nora was still asleep, or close to it, lying on her side with the blanket half slipped off one shoulder. The flannel shirt had twisted in the night, bearing part of her thigh and a strip of her hip where the blanket didn't cover. She didn't seem aware of it. Her breathing was steady for once, not shallow and quick like the night before. He stood without a sound, threw on his coat, and stepped outside to check the yard. The sky was gray, and frost coated the fence rails. His breath steamed as he crossed to the lean-to to grab kindling. He half expected to see tracks that didn't belong, hoof prints, boot marks, but the ground was undisturbed except for his own. Whoever she'd escaped from either didn't know which direction she ran or didn't care enough to chase far. When he came back inside, she was awake and watching the doorway. Not startled, just alert in the way someone gets after too many bad mornings. She'd covered her legs again and pulled the blanket higher around her chest. Her hair was tangled at one side where she'd slept on it. The bruise along her collarbone had deepened to a dark purple, and the faint lines on her ribs had turned yellow around the edges. Pain still sat under the skin, but she wasn't clutching her side as hard as the day before. I'm making coffee, Caleb said, setting the kindling near the hearth. There's stew left from last night. She nodded once. He noticed her eyes go to the door, not because she wanted to leave, but to check if it was still barred. He didn't comment. As the fire caught, he glanced at her again. There were questions hanging between them. How far she'd come, how long she meant to stay, whether danger was still following, but she didn't look ready to unload any of it. He wasn't in a hurry to hear it either. What mattered more right now was making sure she could stand, eat, and breathe without flinching. He poured her the first cup when the water boiled. She hesitated before taking it, maybe expecting strings attached. When nothing happened after she wrapped her hands around a tin cup, some of the tension in her shoulders eased. "You said they traded you," he said, not as a challenge, but because the silence had to break somewhere. She kept her eyes on the steam. "Last winter, I was with a group heading west. Family at first. When rations got thin, they left me with another camp in exchange for food and a wagon wheel. After that, it was trading hands every few weeks. Some paid with coin. Others just took. Any names?" Caleb asked. "Towns they passed." She shook her head, kept moving. "I ran when one fell asleep drunk, but another dragged me back. This last group camped outside a mining road 2 days south. I cut loose sometime in the night. Thought maybe I'd die in the hills before they found me again." He stirred the coals with the iron poker and thought through what she said. Mining road to the south meant drifters, gamblers, hired men. They weren't the type to waste time tracking a woman who slipped away unless they planned to sell her further for profit. "If any of them show," he said, "you don't open that door. Let me deal with it." She looked at him, unsure if that was protection or warning. "You'll send me off if they come." "I didn't say that." Her brow furrowed slightly. She didn't push the matter. Instead, she asked the first thing that revealed she was starting to think about tomorrow instead of yesterday. "You live off the land here?" "No one else nearby. Nearest cabin's 7 miles north. Old trapper. Don't think he's come down in over a year. Town's half a day by trail if you walk, couple hours by horse." "And you just stay? Alone?" He didn't answer right away. He ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of her. "Work don't stop just because there's no one to hear you talk." She ate slower than yesterday, stopping only when her side ached. Caleb watched her movements with the same measuring calm he had the night they met. He could tell she was testing whether the safety here was temporary or something she could rely on. By midday, he went outside to haul water and check the fence line. She surprised him by stepping out onto the porch, the flannel shirt reaching just above her knees, bare legs marked with faint bruises and healed scratches. The cold air turned her breath white. "I can help with something," she said, not as an offer but a fact. "I can wash, or mend, or carry small wood." He studied her posture. She wasn't trying to impress him. She just didn't want to sit useless. He pointed toward the stacked kindling by the shed. "Short pieces go by the hearth. Don't lift more than you can carry." She nodded and crossed the yard carefully, wincing only once when she bent to pick up a few logs. The shirt shifted when she moved, exposing more of her thigh, but she didn't seem to care or notice. He forced his eyes away and focused on the fence rail that had come loose over time. While she worked, he took in things he hadn't noticed before. The way she scanned the treeline every few moments, how she flinched when a crow startled overhead, how her fingers kept flexing as if remembering ropes around her wrists. He wondered what she'd been called before Nora, if that was even her real name. When the wood was carried in and stacked neat by the hearth, she stood by the door, catching her breath. Caleb came in behind her, wiping his hands with a cloth. "You're not expected to earn your keep," he said simply. She met his eyes. "I know, but I don't want to feel like a burden." "Then don't," he said. "Just heal." For the first time since he'd found her, she didn't look at the floor after someone spoke to her. Her eyes held as a steady second before she turned back to the fire. He saw something shift in her expression, still guarded, but no longer waiting for the worst. Outside, the wind picked up again. Caleb checked the latch once more, out of habit, and something else he didn't want to name yet. The thought came without invitation. If she stayed, the cabin wouldn't feel as empty, and if someone came looking, he wouldn't hide from them. The next morning broke colder than the last. Frost glazed the window, and the ground outside looked hard as iron. Caleb got the fire going again before sunrise. Nora was already awake, sitting upright on the cot with the blanket around her shoulders. She didn't look startled like she had the night before. She just watched him quietly while he moved through his routine. Her breathing sounded less tight today, and she wasn't holding her ribs as often. Still, he could tell the pain hadn't left entirely. When he handed her a tin cup with hot water and leftover stew, she took it without hesitation this time. The distrust hadn't vanished, but something in her face had settled. The question wasn't whether he would hurt her. It was whether he would change his mind later. Caleb pulled on his coat and boots. "I've got snares set past the ridge." I'll be gone a few hours. Nora's eyes tracked him. If someone knocks, you don't answer. Keep the bar down. Gun's on the shelf by the door if it comes to it. You fire once, I'll hear it. She looked at the gun, then back at him. There was something unspoken there. Relief, maybe, or disbelief that he'd trust her with a weapon. She didn't test the moment with questions. Caleb stepped outside. The cold hit hard, but the air was clear. He checked the yard again, scanning for tracks. Nothing new. He made his way to the ridge, the silence pressing in the way it always did. Though this time, he kept thinking about the cabin. If she decided to run, he'd find her tracks and follow. But he had a feeling she wouldn't. Not yet. Back at the cabin, Nora set the empty bowl on the table and stood slowly. Her legs were stiff from the cold, and the oversized shirt brushed her thighs as she walked. She glanced around the one-room space. It was the first time she'd really looked, not just checked exits. There were only a few things in the room. A shelf with dried herbs and old tins, Caleb's tools by the door, a folded blanket chest, boots by the wall, and the abandoned half-built cradle frame covered with canvas in the corner. She studied it for a moment, recognizing it wasn't firewood. She didn't touch it. She gathered the shirt she'd washed the day before, his patched one drying by the fire, and the ruined dress. The dress couldn't be fixed, but she folded it anyway and tucked it under the crate. She wiped the table with a strip of cloth, swept ash near the hearth with her hands, and stacked the rest of the kindling he'd brought in. Work kept her from thinking too long about the past. It also kept her from imagining being dragged away again. Mid-morning, she heard something outside. Footsteps in the dirt, steady and sure. She stiffened, every muscle going tight. She reached for the gun on the shelf with slow fingers, not pointing it, just holding it close in both hands. The latch lifted. The bar raised. The door opened. Caleb stepped inside, shutting it behind him. His eyes flicked to the gun in her hands. He didn't look angry or surprised, only checked her expression before nodding once. "You heard me coming," he said. "I wasn't sure it was you." "You did right." He set down 2 rabbits and a pheasant on the table. His hands were cold and rough from the walk, but he moved with the same even pace. Nora laid the gun back on the shelf carefully. She didn't apologize, and he didn't expect it. A moment passed with only the crackle of the fire between them. Caleb hung his coat and looked over at her. "You're walking steadier." She glanced at her ribs, then back at him. "It still hurts, but not as much." He nodded once. "You can rest again after you eat. I'll skin what I brought in." As he worked the rabbits with his knife, she found herself speaking before she planned to. "You don't ask much. I don't need much answered yet." She hesitated. "Most men ask where I slept, what was done to me, who touched me. You don't." Caleb scraped the blade clean. "I don't need to hear what I already see. If you want to tell it, that's yours to decide." She let that sit. It was the closest thing to permission she'd been given in a long time. Not to explain, just to choose. After they ate, she stood and moved slower toward the door. "I can fetch water. It's not far. You walk with the bucket, not both hands full. If your side pulls, set it down." He didn't argue that she should rest. He'd already seen that giving her nothing to do made her feel cornered. She stepped outside into the thin sunlight. The cold bit through the shirt, but she didn't flinch. At the creek, she knelt to fill the bucket and caught her reflection in the water. Hollow cheeks, bruises fading but still there, hair wild. She hadn't seen her own face in weeks. She didn't study it long. Back inside, Caleb had cleared the table and hung the skinned pheasant to drain. She set the bucket down and wiped her hands on the shirt hem. "Your name," he said then, not demanding, just asking because he realized she'd given him only one word and he didn't know if it was truth. "Is Nora what you were born with, or what you kept?" She blinked once, then answered, "It's mine. I kept it even when they tried to rename me." "Then it stays here," he said simply. She didn't thank him, but something in her chest loosened. She sat near the fire, the blanket pulled over her legs again. Caleb took the pot down to wash it and didn't speak further. Outside, the wind began to change, carrying the scent of distant smoke from a campfire somewhere in the hills. Caleb noticed it first, and his jaw tightened. He didn't say anything yet, but he'd be watching the tree line tonight. And Nora, without fully knowing why, didn't look at the door in fear this time. She looked because she understood now that someone else would be listening for danger too. Caleb stepped outside before sundown, the cold air cutting through his coat. The scent of distant smoke still rode the wind, faint but real. He scanned the ridge line, the trees beyond the creek, the trail leading down toward the south. He didn't see movement, didn't hear horses, but his instincts sharpened all the same. He had lived alone long enough to know when a change in the wind meant someone was out there. Inside, Nora sat at the table, mending the sleeve of one of his shirts with thread she'd salvaged from a ruined dress. The flannel shirt he'd given her hung better on her frame now that the sleeves were rolled up and the blanket wasn't draped over her shoulders. Her ribs still hurt, but she moved without the pinched breath she'd had the first day. He came back in and latched the door. She looked up, the needle paused halfway through a stitch. "You saw something?" she asked. "Not yet," he said, "but someone's burning wood nearby. Could be hunters. Could be travelers doubling back to town." She didn't panic, but her grip on the fabric tightened. Her eyes went to the gun on the shelf. Caleb noticed and didn't comment. "You got enemies who'd follow this far?" he asked. "One man," she said after a pause. "The last one I was traded to. He liked breaking things that didn't fight back. He might come because I was the only thing he owned that he didn't sell yet." Caleb's jaw flexed, but he kept his voice even. "Why'd you say he'd come alone? He doesn't share. Others only followed him because he had a wagon and coin. They'd leave if there's nothing in it." Caleb filed that away. A single man was easier to deal with in a group, but trouble was trouble. As the light outside faded, Nora finished the stitch and set the shirt aside. "If he finds his place, I'll leave before he brings you into it." "You're here," Caleb said. "If he comes, I deal with him." She studied him like she couldn't fit that logic into what she knew of men. Most would have demanded payment in advance. Most would have locked her in or tied her down to keep her from being taken by someone else. Instead, he started clearing the table, quiet as always. While he worked, Nora's eyes drifted to the corner of the cabin where the half-built cradle frame sat under the canvas. It wasn't the first time she'd looked at it, but tonight she asked, "You built that?" He didn't pretend not to hear her. "Started it when my wife was carrying. Couldn't finish it after." Nora's expression changed. Not pity, not apology, but understanding of a kind she didn't have to explain. She didn't ask about the grave or the illness. She didn't need to. The unfinished would spoke enough. She stood slowly, careful of her ribs. "You built space for someone, and then there was no one left to use it." He didn't answer. He set a pot of water on the fire, and the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. As night took full hold, Caleb barred the door and set the rifle by his bedroll near the hearth. Nora watched his movements carefully. She glanced at the cot, then at the floor where he usually slept. "You can take the bed tonight," he said. "You're still healing." "And you?" she asked. "I'll sleep light by the fire. If anyone comes near the yard, I'll hear them before they get close." She hesitated, then finally crossed to the cot. Her steps were slow but steady. She didn't bother with the blanket right away. She sat first, then pulled it across her legs. The flannel shirt slipped enough to bare one shoulder, but she didn't flinch or rush to cover it. Caleb settled onto his rolled blanket. The firelight threw low shadows across the room. He didn't look directly at her, but he saw enough. The curve of her hip under the blanket, the way her hair fell over her collarbone, the faint bruising that remained but no longer defined her posture. After a long stretch of quiet, she spoke again. "You haven't asked what I plan to do when I can walk farther." "You don't owe me a plan," he said. "You stay until you don't need to. Then you choose your road. What if I don't have one? Then you make one." She went silent again, thinking on that. Caleb watched the flames shift. At one point, her breathing caught like she wanted to say something else, then steadied. After a few minutes, she said, "You didn't ask what I did before they took me." "You're not doing it now," he replied. She looked at the door, then back at him. "I cooked at a stopover ranch. Cleaned rooms, washed linens. I wasn't allowed to leave the property alone, but it was better than camps." "Why'd you leave?" "The owner died. His son sold everything and threw the workers out. I tried heading east with a couple families, but when trouble hit, I was easier to trade than feed." Caleb said nothing more, but the pieces fit into place. She had belonged to nothing and no one long before men started passing her around like cargo. Outside, branches creaked in the wind. Caleb listened, shoulders tense, but controlled. Nora watched him a moment longer before lying back on the cot. For the first time since arriving, she turned her back to the door instead of facing it. And though neither said it, both of them knew the difference that made. Caleb barely slept. He rested on his side, near the hearth with one arm under his head, listening past the crackle of the fire for anything that didn't belong. He'd grown used to silence over the years, the kind that pressed against the walls and stayed there, but having someone else breathing in the room made that silence feel different. Not unwelcome, just unfamiliar. A branch snapped somewhere beyond the creek sometime before dawn. Caleb's hand closed around the rifle before he was fully awake. He pushed himself up slow and listened. No voices, no hooves, just the wind shifting. He stayed alert a long minute, then lowered the rifle but didn't lie back down. Nora was awake too. He could tell by the way her breathing had changed, steady but not deep. She didn't speak. She kept still, watching the darkness from the cot, the way someone listens for footsteps they remember too well. When daylight finally thinned the shadows, Caleb stood and added a log to the fire. Nora sat up, the blanket slipping to her waist. She didn't reach for it immediately. The flannel shirt hung open at the collar, showing the marks fading along her chest and shoulder. The bruises had dulled to yellow and brown. Her ribs didn't seem as tight when she moved. "You heard it too," she said quietly. "Yeah, you think it was them? Could have been anything," he said. "Didn't sound close." She nodded, but didn't fully believe it. Her eyes went to the rifle leaning near his bedroll, then to the door. Caleb saw the thought cross her face. Whether she should leave before trouble came down on them both. He broke the quiet first. "I'm riding out a mile east after coffee. If someone camped close, they'll leave tracks." She studied him, unsure if that was meant for her sake or his own. "If you find something, you tell me." "I will." He poured her a cup and set on the table. She came to sit across from him, bare legs brushing the cold floorboards. Her hair was tangled from sleep, falling half across her face. She didn't bother to hide how tired she still was. He noticed the difference. She no longer watched every move he made like she expected a hand to follow. After they ate, he put on his coat and holstered his pistol. "Don't open the door for any reason," he said. "If someone calls out, wait for my voice." She stood near the hearth, hands tucked into the sleeves of the shirt. "You think he found the trail? I think men like that don't forget what they think belongs to them. But finding this place ain't easy, and coming alone is dumber than most are brave." That seemed to settle something in her. She didn't argue. She didn't offer to follow. She just watched him leave with an expression that said she wasn't sure what she hoped he'd find, signs of danger or signs of nothing. Caleb followed deer tracks along the ridge and cut down toward the creek bend. He crouched near the bank, pressing his fingers into a patch of disturbed mud. A horse had come through sometime in the night, not his. Prints were shallow, one animal, maybe two. No wagon, no heavy gear. The trail angled toward the south road, but didn't come closer to the cabin. He followed it farther than he planned, just to be sure. The hoof prints turned toward the foothills and faded where the ground went rocky. Nothing else. No campfire ash. No tarp remnants. No boot marks. He wasn't convinced yet, but he didn't sense pursuit close enough to matter that day. When he got back, Nora had swept the floor and scraped the ash box clean. She'd washed the bowls and hung his second shirt to dry. The ruined dress was still folded under the crate, but she'd cut one sleeve off it and used it as a rag. She looked up when he entered, searching his face for answers before he spoke. One rider passed close to the creek, Caleb said, unlatching his coat. "Didn't turn this way. Tracks headed south. Could be someone passing through," she said, but her voice carried a tension she tried to hide. "Could be," he agreed. Either way, no sign they were hunting anything. She exhaled, not in relief exactly, but in something close. Then she surprised him by asking, "How long you think I stay here before someone in town asks questions?" "Town don't ask after me, and they won't ask after you unless you walk in and start talking." He sat at the table. "You're not a secret. You're just none of their business." She absorbed that. It was the first time he'd spoken like she had a place here, even an unspoken one. Afternoon passed in quiet work. Caleb cut wood outside, while Nora mended the seams on the coat she'd slept in. When the wind shifted, she paused and listened, then looked toward the door. Not in panic this time, but in habit. She asked him once, "You ever thought about leaving this land?" He shook his head. Nowhere else to go that isn't just another empty place. And if someone tried to make you leave, I'd remind them whose land they stepped on. She was silent after that, but not withdrawn. She started setting 2 bowls on the table when the stew simmered, not waiting for him to ask. When he carried water in, she reached to take the bucket from him without flinching at his closeness. Later, when the fire burned down to embers and he slid the rifle closer to his bedroll, she watched him without fear. "You gonna check again before you sleep?" she asked. "Yeah. And if he comes? The man I told you about?" Caleb didn't look up from the rifle. "He won't walk off this land with you. That's the end of it." She didn't thank him. She didn't argue. She just pulled the blanket over herself on the cot and let her eyes close with slower breathing than any night before. And Caleb, for the first time since finding her behind that barrel, let himself lie down without his hand already on the grip of his gun. Caleb rose before the light touched the window. The fire had burned down, but the cabin still held the night's warmth. Nora was asleep on the cot, one arm resting outside the blanket, the flannel shirt sliding down her shoulder. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, checking her breathing out of habit rather than concern. She didn't startle when he moved now. That was new. He took the rifle and stepped outside. The sky was pale and cold, the kind of morning where sound carried. He circled the yard, boots crunching frost, eyes scanning the tree line. No tracks, no smoke, no sign of the rider who'd passed near the creek. He checked the horse, the shed, the fence, then came back in. Nora stirred when he pushed the door shut. She sat up slowly, rubbing the side of her neck. Her bruises had faded to a shadow, and the stiffness in her ribs had eased. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer dictated every breath she took. Caleb set the rifle aside and poured water into the pot to heat. While they ate, she watched him like she was weighing a question. Finally, she said, "If I ask to stay longer, if I don't leave when I'm healed, would that be a problem?" He didn't look surprised. "You're not a guest. You're here same as me. If you stay because you want to, not because someone's chasing you, that's your say." She traced the rim of her cup with her thumb. "I don't have anywhere worth walking toward, and I don't want to end up back in hands that think I owe them something." "You're not leaving this place unless you walk out on your own feet," he said. "Nobody comes here and claims you again." Her eyes stayed on him a long moment. She gave a small nod, slow and certain, not the panic kind she had the first night. Later in the morning, he went to the shed to mend a cracked board. Nora followed him outside, gathering a bundle of smaller logs without being told. The cold didn't bother her as sharply now. She still wore his shirt, though she'd belted it at the waist with a strip of cloth. Her legs were bare from mid-thigh down, skin marked but healing. She carried the wood to the porch and stacked it without asking where it should go. Caleb glanced at her when he passed. "You need a coat before snow hits next week, and boots that fit." She exhaled through a faint smile that wasn't quite one. "I haven't owned boots in 2 months. Then we'll get some," he said. "I'll ride to town in a day or 2. If anyone asks who you are, they'll get told straight." "What do you call me?" "Nora. Same as you told me." She stood quiet at that. No one had used her name like it belonged to her in a long time. By midday, Caleb checked the snares again, while Nora cleaned the basin and swept the corner where she used to sleep. The ruined dress she folded into strips and used to pack cracks in the window frame. When she caught sight of the half-built cradle again, she didn't turn away this time. She touched the edge of the canvas covering it. "You ever think of finishing it?" "No reason before," he said, standing in the doorway. "Might be reason now. Doesn't have to be what it was for." She didn't press further, but she didn't avoid it anymore. That said enough. Evening came without trouble. No riders. No footprints. No distant shouts. The wind shifted to the west, carrying nothing but pine and cold. Caleb brought in water and a pheasant he'd trapped earlier. Nora stood at the table, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back with a strip of cloth. She moved comfortably in the space now, not like someone waiting to be dragged out. After they ate, she sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the door, then at him. If the man I told you about ever finds this land, what then? Caleb didn't hesitate. He won't walk off it, and you won't leave with him. That's finished. She studied him for any sign of bluff. There wasn't one. Silence held a while before she spoke again. I don't know how to live beside someone without giving something up. Then don't give anything up, he said. Just live here. She breathed out, the kind of breath people let go only when they stop bracing for hands on them. She reached out then, slow, unsure, and set her hand on the table near his. He didn't grab it, didn't move away. He just turned his hand palm up so her fingers rested against his skin. No words passed after that. They stayed there a long moment with the fire low and the door barred. When she finally stood and crossed to the cot, she didn't face the door. She lay on her side with her back to the wall and waited. Caleb put another log on the fire and then came over. He didn't take the floor this time. He sat on the edge of the cot first, testing if she'd stiffen. She didn't. He lay down behind her, slow, so the boards didn't creak. She shifted enough to rest her hand on his arm, not pulling him in, not pushing him away. Her breathing eased when she felt the weight of him there, not as something pinning her, but as something keeping watch. He didn't touch her anywhere else, didn't press closer than she allowed. They stayed like that without speaking, the lantern low and the wind quieting outside. Nora closed her eyes knowing the door was barred and someone was listening for footsteps other than hers. Caleb closed his with the understanding that the cabin wasn't empty anymore and wouldn't be again unless she chose it. By the time the fire settled into embers, she had stopped waking to every sound, and he no longer listened for her to leave in the night. The space held them both without question. And when morning came, there was no talk of her moving on. There was an extra plate set out on the table and a place by the fire that was no longer temporary.